Eccoci. Buonasera a tutti. Saluto Michele Boldrin e il professor Robert Gerwath per essere venuti qui questa sera in occasione della quinta puntata della Tana dell'Orco, la rubrica in cui appunto ci occupiamo di intervistare storici e studiosi e a condividere le loro ricerche. Ecco, questa sera abbiamo l'onore e il privilegio di avere il professor Robert Gerwath, che è professore presso lo University College di Dublino, nonché direttore del Center for War Studies della medesima università. Oggi abbiamo appunto qui il professore per discutere di una sua pubblicazione, il cui titolo potete vedere nel titolo stesso di questa live, che è appunto La rabbia dei vinti, la guerra dopo la guerra, 1917-1923. Qui vi faccio vedere la copia fisica in italiano edita dalla Terza, quindi insomma trovate comunque il link al libro nella descrizione del video, quindi se avete desiderio di acquistarlo, ecco, sapete dove andare a trovare i riferimenti. Bene, dopo questa brevissima introduzione,
non
ovviamente
siamo sponsorizzati dalla Terza.
No, non siamo sponsorizzati da nessuno per ora, poi chissà, vedremo. Comunque, ovviamente il resto della conversazione, almeno in diretta, sarà fatta in inglese, quindi adesso passeremo all'inglese. Cercheremo di fare l'upload poi dei sottotitoli in italiano, così che magari anche chi non ha possibilità di seguire in diretta in lingua inglese possa poi recuperare il contenuto in italiano. So let's switch to English. Thank you again, Professor Gerwath, for joining us for this live broadcast about your book.
Well, thank you very much for having me on the podcast.
Okay, so I think Michele wanted to ask you a first question just to give, to prepare the floor for the rest of the interview, just to understand which is the bottom line, the reason why you decided to write such a book. And yes, we can start with that and then we can move on from that. Thank you very much again for joining us.
Okay, yes, no, it's a great pleasure to be with you. And it is a really interesting question that you asked, because in some ways, I think I have to explain the reason why I wrote the book from a biographical point of view, because I moved to Ireland in 2007, having grown up in Germany, and then moving to Britain, where I studied history for my PhD. And in both countries, there's a very familiar story about the First World War, that it began in 1914 and it ended in 1918. And of course, in Britain in particular, but also to a certain extent in France and in the United States, that, you know, the 11th of the 11th, 1918 is a date that is almost sort of mystical. It's the date when peace came to Europe. And when I moved to Ireland to take up my current position, after talking to colleagues here about the 20th century and, you know, what was the 20th century like and what were the big markers, the chronological markers of that century, I suddenly started to have questions, because from an Irish point of view, those dates made very little sense, right? In Ireland, after the end of the First World War, there's a war, the War of Independence from Britain, followed by a very vicious civil war, which lasted until 1922. And then I began to wonder to what extent our narratives about the First World War had really been primarily what I would call Western Front narratives, the narratives of Germany, Britain, and France in particular, with all the other combatants, not just in Europe, but also around the world, as sideshows. So I began to be much more interested in the ways in which violence continued after 1918, but also in the destiny of those who found themselves on the losing end of the First World War. Of course, primarily the Central Powers, Germany, Austria-Hungary, Bulgaria, and the Ottoman Empire. But also, and this is, I think, where Italy comes in, countries that were on the winning side of the First World War, but felt that they had been somewhat cheated out of that victory at the Paris Peace Conference. So I wanted to tell perhaps a less familiar story about those years, quite formative years in many ways, if you think about it. The years between 1917 and 1923 are the focus of the book. And a lot happens in those years, right? I mean, you see the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, you see the birth of fascism in Italy, but also in Germany, when really Hitler becomes politically conscious and active and formulates what National Socialism might look like. You have pretty devastating wars in Poland, for example, but also in the Ottoman Empire, leading ultimately to the defeat of Greece and the expulsion of some 1.5 million people, either Muslims or Christians, who have to cross the Aegean Sea either way on the basis of their religion. There's also massive redrawing of the European map, and I try to kind of explain how that all happened and tell the story of the First World War from the perhaps, at least in Western Europe, less familiar perspective of those who were on the losing side of the war, or who felt that they were on the losing side. And that's true for the majority of European countries. I also try to explain why in the period between 1917 and 1923, so officially the peace years, more people died than during the First World War. And that's not even counting in those who succumbed to the Spanish flu, the influenza wave, which of course killed a huge number of people, but also as a result of revolutions and counter-revolutions, of civil wars, but also interstate wars. And how come that we have forgotten that part of history, at least in the kind of mainstream narratives about the First World War in Western Europe? So that was the reason, and I very consciously decided to also begin and end the story from the geographical margins of Europe. I often think that if you look at history, the history of the European continent from the margins, that changes your perspective in quite interesting ways. So I begin in Smyrna, in the late Ottoman Empire, and with the burning of Smyrna, that port city that was inhabited by a combination of Muslims and Greek Orthodox people, and which at the end of the Greek-Turkish War that began in 1919 and ended in a few years later, was destroyed and largely burned to the ground, particularly the Christian quarters. And I thought to those people, or to those people who found themselves in the midst of the very brutal Russian Civil War, the story that we are so familiar with just doesn't make any sense, because the 11th of November 1918 did not bring a period of peace for them. And it's actually true for the majority of European societies. And if you look at the margins, geographical margins, it I think makes a lot of sense. If you look at Finland, which experienced a very brutal civil war in 1918, which within 3 months kills about 1% of the overall population. And so these narratives don't quite fit into the master stories of the 20th century. And I try to kind of bring them back into the focus. That was the main purpose of the book.
Let me then I'll give, but I want to push it a bit further on that. Yes, those events that you narrate and describe and analyze in the books, I agree, are probably forgotten by a large number, not only of lay people, but also of historians, and are often kind of jumped over when we try to understand Second World War, the beginning of fascism and Nazism, and so on. But there is a sense in reading the book that one wonders, does he have a theory that is in this gigantic carnage that you actually describe? I have to say, and this is maybe with age I'm becoming less able to read the tough description. The book sometimes is extremely precise and realistic, and sometimes I had to push myself through the page because I felt somewhat sick in front of the text. But apart from that, is there a theory of what caused this enormous destruction? Is it just the disappearing of the major empires? Is it the fear of Bolshevism? Is it just the very late form in which national identities appear in Europe, and because they appear in the 20th century, with a certain technology, with a certain identity of the empires. They produce the dramatic level of fighting and killing. What do you have a theory behind it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's a really good question. I mean, I started off as a historian of the Second World War before I came to the First World War. Again, this has to do with the fact that I moved to Dublin, where for a long time people have been working on the First World War in particular. And the question I asked myself is, how do we explain what has been called the civilianization of warfare? So why is it that in the Second World War in particular, as opposed to the First, more civilians are killed than combatants? What causes this situation? And this has to be understood against the backdrop of the international powers basically agreeing from the late 19th century on a certain set of rules for military engagement, precisely to protect the lives of civilians. So when does that flip? When does it happen that targeting civilians is not just what you might call a casualty of war, but actually deliberate, that killing those who do not fit into national communities, ideological projects, have to be either expelled or murdered? And I do think that this is something that happens particularly in the later stages of the First World War and then into the post-war period, when first of all, you have these emerging ideological projects, but I think ideology is not sufficient to explain all of it. There are also realms of possibility, I would say. So violence is also always a matter of opportunity, where there are spaces in which the state does not exist. So you have various armed groups that very often see themselves as the legitimate heirs of the bygone states that have collapsed. But they fight amongst each other. That's one thing. The second one is that despite what we know about the Paris Peace Conference and the Paris Peace Treaties, as a matter of fact, the peacemakers in Paris have relatively little control over these vast spaces. They don't have any troops in Eastern Europe. They can't even control a resurgent Turkey, which is now sort of attacking the peace settlement, the first peace treaty that was signed with the Ottoman authorities. So mainly the borders, or what constitutes the borders and what to do with minorities, is negotiated on the ground, and it's negotiated on the ground in very violent ways. Then you have the issue of minorities. No one talked about minorities up to 1914. Suddenly everyone talks about minorities and what to do with them in these new national projects that are emerging, these new nation states that suddenly appear. I mean, we have to bear in mind that up until 1914, Europe is really a continent of land empires, or dominated by land empires. And after 1918, there are all these sort of national projects emerging in East Central Europe, but they don't know where the borders of that should be. There are different views on that. And what to do with these very sizable minorities that suddenly live within these new nation states. That's why the peacemakers in Paris force each emerging state to sign the so-called minorities treaties, which are actually quite important because they recognize that this is a major issue. How do we secure the rights of these minorities in states that are very multi-ethnic, but want to be the exact opposite? They want to be ethnically homogenous, religiously homogenous. That's their aim and ambition, and the way in which they see themselves. But the reality is very different. The reality is that they have inherited this closely interwoven, ethnically, religiously interwoven communities within the spaces that are now nation states. So I think this combination, together with the dynamics of revolution and counter-revolution, even where real revolution was never a real possibility, mobilizes people in ways that they hadn't been mobilized for a very long time, and leads to this massive escalation of violence. Now, coming back to the other point that you raised about the sometimes quite graphic nature of the descriptions. The book was written in a different era, it now feels, because that was before the Ukraine war started properly. And I felt that to a certain extent, at least that's my impression that I get from my own students. For them, the Second World War or major international wars in Europe are as remote as the Middle Ages. I mean, I may as well be talking about the Crusades or something. So there was a kind of an absence of understanding, I think, of what physical violence in these spaces actually means, and what it means to live in a basically lawless moment or lawless space in which the stronger can do whatever they want, and in which all rules that had been created around the protection of civilians, about laws of engagement, etc., and what to do with prisoners of war, really quite literally were thrown overboard, and Europe returned to a kind of Hobbesian state of lawlessness. And I felt I needed to describe what that actually means, because I think people had forgotten what it meant. So the horrors of war that we sometimes, even then, of course, saw in far-flung places, felt like there was a very strong sense in Europe, and I think that's still part of the slightly triumphalist narrative of the early 2000s, that we were kind of part of this history of progress, where history had come to an end point, and democracy and freedom and peace were basically the only acceptable or imaginable
at least
future.
somewhere.
Yeah. And I think that perception has changed. No one would say that anymore today. So in that sense, it has probably kind of aged a little bit. But I think in others, it was never actually written as a commentary on our current times. It was quite interesting. I sent it in, and then my publisher, the editor at Penguin, sort of wrote back to me and said, "Ooh, this is actually more topical and contemporary than I thought it would be." But it was never written as such, because, of course, if we want to understand the conflicts that are going on in Ukraine today or in the Middle East, 1918 and the years after are quite pivotal for understanding the tensions between imperial structures, the collapse of imperial structures, alternative projects emerging from it. If you want to understand ISIS and their demand for the return of the caliphate, for example, it's the First World War that they're talking about. And it's quite interesting that in the Middle East, they don't need to explain that. People understand it. I think in Europe, people are more puzzled about it. And the same is true for Ukraine, where we very often reference the Second World War as the prehistory to the current conflict. But really, at the end of the war, it's the first moment of Ukrainian independence. And from that point of view, there is a 100-year story of that independence being taken away by Russia time and again. And I think it is important to understand that master narrative as well, in order to understand why it mobilizes people in such emotional ways.
Yes, thank you very much. I wanted to make a point about what you actually said, because you told us that your editor actually said that this book could be very helpful to understand our contemporary world, the geopolitical, the international tensions that are, striving around the world. But another thing that I really appreciated about the book, and I want your opinion about this, is that I think your book is an eye-opener about how distant we are from that period of time, in the sense of the diffusion of political and social violence, because many opinionists, many scholars, many journalists love to create a comparison between our world every time there is a political crisis, a social crisis, to the 20s and the 30s, like to if as they are comparable in a certain sense, while your book states very clearly that it is inappropriate to do so because the situation, the level of violence that was diffused in Europe, and not only in Europe, was so endemic and so diffused among even the lowest part of the social life that nothing is comparable to what we are living in even today. Even our today's worst crisis is no comparable to what happened that period of time. So I don't know, maybe that's another thing that we should take into consideration, into account every time we reflect on those years, how distant they are from this point of view. That's, the main point of your book. That's to, document the level of political and social violence that was in Europe after the only formal end of World War One.
No, I mean, you're absolutely right about that. I think the levels of violence that people encountered in that period is obviously fundamentally different from whatever crisis we currently think we're in. And I think we need to remind ourselves of that. That is absolutely true. I think people are currently concerned about the future in ways that they probably haven't been for a very long time, because it feels now for nearly a decade that we have been experiencing, probably even more if we add in the economic crisis at the beginning of this century, that the certainties that we had assured ourselves of in the 1990s, certainly that optimism has gone. And I think that people are beginning to look for historical orientation in different periods and orientation about what it is that we might be looking at, what might be coming. One of the most frequently cited poems for a long time now, many years, is W.B. Yeats's The Second Coming, which is a very powerful poem. And I'm mentioning him because he used to live a few blocks away. So he's not only a Nobel Prize winner, but also a local hero. But when he talked about, in the poem, what rough beast its hour come at last, slouches towards Bethlehem to be born, I think that is a question that is on the minds of many people. Yeats at the time was talking about global communism. That was his main concern. What exactly does it mean? What does it bring? Will the world revolution come? And all sorts of middle-class anxieties were on his mind. But in our case, we don't know what the rough beast is yet. What we see is a rise of populism, left and right. We see increasingly polarized societies, be it in the United States or in Western Europe. And I think a lot of people are uncertain of whether this crisis mode that we are currently subjectively or objectively experiencing, whether that might lead to something as horrific as what happened in the period of the two world wars. Is it possible that with another major, Great Depression or something like that, people will fall back into patterns which they, for a long time, believed they had overcome? That, civilization had sort of moved past that point where we're all killing each other on the battlefields and beyond. And is it something that is viable, that is feasible? And then you look at the map, and that can sometimes, the map of Europe, that is, and it's sometimes quite scary actually to see that if you look at the conflict hotspots at the moment in Europe, all the way from the Middle East through the Caucasus into Turkey, new conflict potential with Greece, Republika Srpska, all the way then into Ukraine. These are the exact same hotspots of violence that existed 100 years ago, and I think that it is quite. I'm not in any way arguing that it's about these spaces or the people that inhabit them, but it is remarkable how resilient these places, these conflict zones really are, and how they can resurge at certain points in time. Presumably because some of the questions that the First World War raised but not solved remain unresolved. And it was really in the period of the Cold War that some of these conflicts, be they ethnic or religious or, about identity, they remained there simmering beneath the surface, and they kind of resurfaced. I mean, look at Yugoslavia in the 1990s. I mean, that was basically, someone had put a very large cork into that bottle and bottled up all the issues, and then it kind of popped out again soon after Tito's death and after the end of the Cold War. So, yeah, I would see it. On the one hand, you're absolutely right about very different levels of violence, and I mean, sometimes I feel when I talk to my students, I just need to remind them of the sheer magnitude of the horrors that happened in that period. I mean, against minorities, we're talking about thousands of pogroms on the western borderlands of the former Russian Empire, and in general, tens of millions of people who died. So that is definitely the case. But I think people are, perhaps rightly, concerned about what the future holds in these circumstances. And I think that the return of a major war to Europe's shores, there have always been conflicts, of course, and we were all horrified about the wars in Yugoslavia, and closer to here, the ongoing conflict in Northern Ireland, all the way up until the Good Friday Agreement. But the return of a major land war fought in trenches with tanks, and even according to very conservative estimates, there are at least 600,000 casualties of that war to date. I think it brings it home in a way that makes a lot of people feel extremely uncomfortable about what the future holds, and you can understand the anxiety in the Baltic states or in Poland, because they are precisely looking back to the periods that I am describing in the book, and they know what happened then, and they know what happened during the Second World War and in the decades afterwards, and they are determined that this will not happen to them again. So I think that helps to explain the sometimes, I think, for Western Europeans, perhaps slightly strange and seemingly paranoid response to Putin's aggressive foreign policy and his invasion of Ukraine.
Before going to that, because inevitably we will have to go to that, let's stay a bit again in what happened in the decade de facto that you're considering, even if 1723 is the core. So it's four empires that come apart, basically. Form some completely, the German and the Austrian, Hungarian, as I would say the Ottoman as well. The Russian goes back and forth. And as you correctly point out, all the controversies they were facing, all the hot situation, all the conflict right now are still within the territories of those empires. If out of two of them, more or less, the Austro-Hungarian has solved its issue in a way or another. It's a lot more stable now in former Yugoslavia, and in general in the Balkan area than it was 20 or 30 years ago. Well, the German Empire had to come back and be severely beaten, no doubt. For the time being, we don't seem to be facing issues there. So it's the Russian and the Ottoman, and in both there is a very strong religious ideological component driving the conflict. In one case, as we know, it's the British-French decision of partitioning it as they pleased, ignoring reality on the ground, and then obviously the arrival of people of a religion that was different from that had been established there for about 1,000, for more than 1,000 years. creating the conflict. In the other, it's a resurgence of a form. That's my reading, and probably you will disagree, and I hope you do. So we learn some different point of view of a very ancient ideology that is an imperial one that mixes itself in a very strange, subtle way with religion, with the Orthodox religion. Is that all that there is? Or is there, and I push the line here a bit, or is there something dramatically wrong than the two big powers of the time, the two big European powers, decided to do, following their imperial desire, that is France and the United Kingdom, way back around the time of Versailles? That is, are we facing something that is an ideological religious conflict that is somewhat independent of the decision taken then, or are we facing a century later mistakes, dramatic mistakes in partitioning territories, in defining state, in assigning power to this or the other dynasty that goes back a century?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's actually a very good point. I mean, I would say probably the latter. I mean, we know that partitioning never really worked. I mean, we have to bear in mind that partitioning was always introduced with the idea that this might prevent violence, right? That partitioning different sections of a population along ethnic or religious lines would have a pacifying effect, but it never worked anywhere, and this includes Northern Ireland. It includes the Ottoman Empire at the time. It includes India. Partitioning never really kind of fulfilled that intended purpose. But it is kind of indicative of population management in those years. So partitioning is, at least from a British point of view, the sort of the best path towards a stable political settlement. And of course, the same is done, even though along lines that administrative lines that had previously existed in the Middle East, where all these sort of post-imperial fantasy states were created. And those were always disputed, who the inheritors of those new states might be, what the political future of those states might be. So I think in that respect, you could certainly say that some of the seeds of the violence that we're seeing today were sown in those years. There's also, I think, quite a change in the historical literature and the assessment of, for example, the League of Nations, which is no longer really seen as a kind of benign instrument of peacekeeping, but really as a liberal imperial project run primarily by Britain and France, where, you know, they called the mandates, but really they were colonies with a different name. They were controlled economically by the two most important Western European states, particularly after the United States had withdrawn from the project. And I think there's something to that criticism. I mean, the sort of the idea of liberal empire continued for many, many years, and I think some of the structures were created in that period. And then after the Second World War, that continued in the form of development aid, which was sort of seen as a new instrument of directing developing states into a future of capitalism, where they wanted to consume, you know, high-end products from the metropolitan center. In terms of the nature, I mean, my argument in the book is actually that in some ways the experience of the end of the war, victory or defeat, or ambivalent victory in the case of Italy, might be the key to understanding certain patterns of violence. So, you know, if you win after 4 years of a historically unprecedented war, that gives a certain element of legitimacy to the existing political system, whereas it doesn't in the case where the existing state loses. And I think that, of course, contributes to revolutions and regime change. In the case of what we might call the revisionist powers, so the major revisionist powers who want to revise the Paris peace treaties, you have, of course, Germany, and but also Russia. You have, I mean, Austria, still German Austria is sort of part of that project as well. But it is the experience of the Second World War and the total defeat in 1945 which ends that revisionist project to a certain extent. Whereas the defeat in 1918, at least from a German perspective, is seen or rather portrayed by nationalist circles as a betrayal. So Germany didn't actually lose the war. It's the narrative that German nationalists use. There are no Allied soldiers on German soil in 1918. So that's why that narrative, despite the fact that it's wrong and the German army was kind of on its knees, hopelessly overstretched and unable to maintain the different fronts that still existed, particularly after its allies had left the coalition or surrendered. But nonetheless, from a nationalist point of view, this idea of the sort of betrayed victory was very much credible, because they hadn't seen an Allied soldier up until they took control of certain territories along the Rhine River. So the narrative was always, it wasn't actually the military defeat, it was the revolution that caused the defeat. So the revolutionaries in Germany who rose in November 1918 and overthrew the political system, they were the ones who stabbed the army in the back. That was the dominant narrative, which was later very successfully utilized by Hitler as well. And I think that what we see in Russia today, Russia, of course, also had a very ambivalent, I mean, it's unclear. Russia lost the war militarily, and it was very clear to Lenin in late 1917, early 1918, that he had no choice but to sign the drastic peace treaty of Brest-Litovsk, which took huge chunks of its western territories, because if he had rejected that treaty, the Germans probably would have been in St. Petersburg and Moscow 2 weeks later, and the revolution would have come to an end. So Russia really is a defeated state, but because henceforth the focus was very much on the success of the revolution, it didn't feel like a defeat. So I think if you ask people in Russia, certainly up until 1990, you know, First World War, what do you think about it? Was it a victory or a defeat? I think relatively few people would have said, well, yeah, Russia was defeated. A regime was defeated, the imperial Russian regime. But from its ashes emerged the glorious Bolshevik revolution. I think that would be the dominant narrative. So it's all a matter of perspective, I'd say. But yeah, there's certainly, I think, a lot to unpack here in that narrative.
Yes, thank you very much. Well, I have another question, because you pointed out very clearly that it's a foolish view to think that the League of Nations was, we can say, a predecessor to the United Nations, you know, because there is a huge political international relations literature that claims that United Nations are, in a certain sense, are preceded by the League of Nations, while instead, what you say is basically that instead, the League of Nations was an heir to the Congress of Vienna and to that word, to that political word. So the international order was perceived by the participants as a guarantee to the imperial nature of their dominions, rather than the creation of a political stability around Europe. And that's the point. So political stability comes in their minds with stability of empires. And that's what they tried to achieve after the First World War, to recreate an order, stability based on empires. But they did not understand, as you claim in the book, that First World War became the trigger that started around Europe a resurgence or an emergence, we can say, of nationalist movements that did not accept the imperial narrative of a dominion under a overruling entity. They wanted their own ruling entity. And so, how much do you think that this foolish view that after such an event like the First World War, there could be a recreation of the order that preceded that war, caused the failure of the project and led to the rise of political violence, and then to the ultimate rise of fascism around Europe?
Yeah, thank you. I'd say in terms of continuities, I mean, the main, there are obviously between the Congress of Vienna and the League of Nations, or the Paris Peace Treaties, initially the conference. There are some big differences as well, in the sense that the Vienna settlement was actually much more inclusive, in the sense that it brought the defeated, namely France, to the table as an equal partner to negotiate the future peace settlement for Europe. Whereas that was not the case in Paris in 1919. And I think that was perhaps partly also, in the longer term, the undoing of the order that was created in Paris. Now, in terms of continuities towards the post-Second World War sort of international order, I think there is a continuity, in the sense that both orders were created to facilitate the interests of the main victor states of the two world wars. So in the First World War, obviously, it was Britain and France. The intention had always been that, after all, it was Woodrow Wilson's pet project to bring the United States on board as a sort of international guarantor. But then the political winds, of course, changed in the US against further interventionism in Europe. Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you now. Probably there was a little...
Yeah, there was a brief moment when something went down on one of the three sides. We are in three different locations. Yeah.
Apologies.
Yeah. No, it's not your fault. It may be one of us.
So in terms of the continuities, and of course we shouldn't forget that in some ways 1919 is the last hurrah of the European superpowers, which already during the war had become totally dependent on the United States as an economic power, but also as a major creditor. They were hugely indebted to the United States, and that disparity of power changed even more over the course of the 1920s, when suddenly Britain and France, with their significantly enlarged informal empire through the mandates, realized that there were far too many threats and conflicts to contain. It was impossible to do so. And then, of course, the Second World War really kind of brought about the dominance of the two new superpowers in the form of the Soviet Union and the United States. So it was very much a non-European bipolar world, in which suddenly the Europeans found themselves very much the junior partner of those two superpowers. So a greatly changed world. But going back to your question about the relationship of that power dynamic and the rise of fascism, I think that precisely the idea that this is an institution, the League of Nations, an instrument to maintain the political and economic interests of Britain and France, most certainly helped fascist propaganda in suggesting that this existing international order was obviously designed not to facilitate the interests of everyone else, but only those of Britain and France. So they could make that case quite credibly, in the same way that, in Italy or in Germany, people were saying, well, why can Britain and France maintain, informal or not, these empires? Why shouldn't we? So I think it gives birth to all sorts of imperial fantasies that then play out violently before the Second World War even, and during as well. So that there are most certainly connections between it. And I think in retrospect, what you can say about the Paris system, I mean, on the one hand, you can say, okay, that they obviously, it wasn't a great peace, right? Particularly when you compare it to the Vienna Congress, which led to an unparalleled peace period in Europe, precisely because it was what you would now call a victory without losers. So it was a sort of a treaty that didn't officially have a party that felt disengaged or disenchanted with the outcome of the negotiations. And that has since always been held up as the kind of ideal, typical peace. On the other hand, I mean, I think it is perfectly understandable why such a peace treaty was probably not feasible in the aftermath of the First World War. If you look at the losses of lives, I mean, people were anticipating a punishment of the defeated, symbolic or otherwise, financial, etc. And interestingly enough, the peacemakers in Paris, particularly those representing democratic societies, were of course very conscious of the fact that they would be voted out of office in no time if they had presented particularly lenient terms. Because there are lots of grieving widows, sons, fathers, mothers in their constituencies who probably would have chased them out immediately. So they were interestingly using a trick in the sense that they talked about reparations, but they didn't actually put a figure on it, because they were very conscious initially that whatever figure they put on the reparations ticket wouldn't be enough in the eyes of their home constituency. So this was only subsequently at the London payment plan that it was agreed on a concrete figure. And in that sense, I think making peace is actually a lot harder for democracies than it is for dictatorships, because the dictator can say, well, you know, the war is over, come home, ideally after a victory. For democracies, that is much harder, because people look at what is being negotiated and what is the outcome of those negotiations, and people are mobilized in very different ways. So it's harder for democracies to make peace, because they're always under the watchful eyes of the publics. And for the first time, I mean, the Paris Peace Conference in 1919 was the first peace conference which was attended by huge numbers of journalists from the home countries, by very large delegations from every corner of the world, petitioning the main three figures there in Paris to listen to their demands for, you know, colonial independence, or at least cultural autonomy or political autonomy. So it's a very different climate in 1919. And I think that partly explains the outcome as it was eventually presented. And we also have to bear in mind that Britain, France, and the United States had very, very different interests in Paris. It always looks as if they were in agreement on the most important things, and they really weren't. For France, its main concern was a potentially resurgent Germany. So they were very keen on creating buffer zones in the West, but also friendly states in the East, like Poland and Czechoslovakia, for example. Whereas Britain, while it was very clear that Germany had to pay reparations and that there had to be some kind of symbolic punishment, perhaps even in the form of trials of senior German military figures, it's worth remembering that Britain was Germany's largest European trading partner before 1914. And Britain also had no interest whatsoever in replacing pre-1914 German hegemony with French hegemony. So for them, returning to status quo ante at some point was desirable. So they actually had a modifying and moderating influence at the negotiation table. And of course, for Wilson himself, the interests were different yet together, because he was quite obsessed with his various pet projects. The idea of sovereignty, for example, played a very dominant role on his mind. The idea of self-determination, of course, self-determination understood in a relatively limited way. So this was for white Europeans, right? It was never intended,
Right,
and probably
right. I was going to get there.
Yeah, it was most certainly misunderstood, shall we say, in the world outside of Europe. That was never what he had intended. We have to bear in mind that Woodrow Wilson is the man who reintroduced segregation in federal offices in the United States. He's a Southerner. He, you would most certainly call him a racist these days, but he certainly had a very particular agenda in his mind, and he was also, of course, quite outspoken about the fact that he, basically wanted the export of an American-style political system to Europe. He was deeply suspicious of empires, of secret diplomacy, and all these things. So, the three major Allied powers in Paris came to the negotiation table with very different perspectives.
On this line, though, it's hard. You pointed out quite clearly some of the contradictions that the Wilson approach had, and it's not obvious from my point of view of a dilettante reader if in all this he and the United States diplomats were the gullible ones, or just the hypocritical. That is, they had something to pursue in terms of American interest and expansion of the newborn, so to speak, American empire. They had a very clear racist, religiously driven notion of what the right to self-determination, who didn't. And then on the major issues, whenever there was a doubt, they always let the Foreign Office from London carry the day, particularly in the Middle East. If one looks at what happens in the Middle East and all their position, both then and for the 25, 27, actually almost 30 years that followed up to Resolution 181, at the very end, I don't know, I'll let you say. It's not even clear to me, both from your books and from other, if they understood was on the table, or if they really thought, oh, well, that's such a secondary part of the war. Who cares? Those guys are just a bunch of camel riders. Why should we bother? With due respect, that seemed to be a bit of the attitude.
No, absolutely. And I mean, I think it is worth bearing in mind that Wilson had no interest in the Middle East whatsoever. The United States never declared war on the Ottoman Empire. It was sort of beyond its core area of interest, which he saw very much as being Europe, particularly Eastern Europe, and particularly certain states. Czechoslovakia was sort of the darling of the Western powers, and sort of they really bought into the narrative of the Habsburg Empire as a people's prison, which was, a great success of Czech propaganda. That this was kind of filtered back into sort of intellectual circles in Washington.
Well, Prague was a beautiful city even back then.
Absolutely, Prague was a beautiful city. I think there are two main differences. So first of all, Wilson, of course, as an intellectual, as a university professor, his approach to the whole peace settlement is a lot more theoretical. It's less hands-on, but it probably also, it's okay in the sense that America didn't lose nearly as many people in that war. They come to the party quite late. So the stakes are much higher for the French in particular, which have seen, the north eastern part of their country completely devastated and very significant losses. Also in Britain, without the devastations at home, but they are a lot more invested, and they have very clear interests in the Middle East. They are fully conscious at that point about the oil richness of the region, but they also have other interests. For example, they see themselves as patron saints of the Christian minorities in that part of the world. I mean, for Lord George is quite obsessed with the Ottoman Empire, which he always saw as this rogue state that was continuously in the business of suppressing its Christian minorities, for example. And he's much clearer from the start that dismantling the Ottoman Empire is a war aim for him, which he's not that outspoken about in relation to the Habsburg Empire, for example, that comes in quite late in the war. So there are different vested interests in the Middle East in particular, and France and Britain are already during the war sort of agreeing on separate spheres of interest, and by 1919 they're probably wondering who pulled the leg of the other and got the better parts, which Britain got the more oil-rich parts of today's Iraq, shall we say. So they clearly had a better picture of what was to be found where, whereas France sort of ended with Syria in particular. But they had a much stronger vested interest in the whole Eastern question, as they called it. I think there are very clear geopolitical reasons for that, apart from the oil. It's about controlling the Suez Canal and the pathway to India, but also to Australia, for example, and its strategic value. So to Wilson, none of that really mattered. What he didn't like, though, is that his partners had already during the war engaged in this kind of secret diplomacy that he was deeply against, and that they had already sort of partitioned the Middle East. But he sort of, he was slightly hypocritical about that, because he always sort of used that as an argument against other states, but sort of looked away when it concerned his principal allies.
Well, thank you very much. And regarding Woodrow Wilson, I would like to recommend to our audience a book that I think it's quite revealing about the real impact and the real role of Woodrow Wilson, what he meant when he said what he said at the end of World War I. That is a book by a colleague of Professor Gerwath, that is John Cooper, who wrote a book called Reconsidering Woodrow Wilson, and the title speaks for itself. So I would really recommend you to read this book to better understand who was Woodrow Wilson and its role after World War I. Now, since we reached our hour, we've reached our hour
but
time.
I want to ask Robert one more question, probably,
Yeah,
and
for
feel
sure,
free not to
for
answer.
sure.
I'll try to be as brief as possible.
Yeah, it's going to be brutal. I want to just to understand, take it as a way of getting the opinion of a much better informed colleague on the issue. What's your reading? Or if you had to bet on a scenario a year from now, east of Poland, east of Romania, what are you going to say? In light what you learn with your work, obviously.
Well, I mean, there are a lot of variables in that mix right now. A lot really depends on the elections in the United States, of course, because I don't think that the war in Ukraine is going to be sustainable without American support. I don't think there is much appetite in Europe at this point to substantially increase the support for Ukraine, in addition to what is already happening, in which case Ukraine will lose the war. And what exactly that means for the foreseeable future, whether that feeds Putin's appetite for more, or whether the military is now so substantially weakened that it can't actually... I don't see him attacking a NATO country. I don't think that is feasible, because he realizes, unless, of course, President Trump Part 2 decides that he abandons NATO altogether, which would add a lot of spice into the mix, I would say, and because then Britain, Europe would basically be on its own, and I would say at a stage of unpreparedness, military unpreparedness for an attack on NATO's eastern border. Now, I don't see that as an imminent threat, but there is an imminent threat that Putin might take smaller dissident republics back into the fold in Eastern Europe before he makes any move on NATO. I really can't see that happening, particularly since his own forces have also been, of course, weakened by the sustained military effort in Ukraine. But yeah, so as so often, a lot depends on US elections coming up. So
and you do see Trump as a much more realistic and cold-blooded opposite of Wilson?
I take seriously his slogan of America first. I think that in some ways, despite his racism, Wilson was also a hopeless idealist. Sort of, you have those two sides to him. I don't see much idealism in Trump. I think he's a very sort of hard-nosed America first, and then we see about the rest kind of guy. And that probably appeals to a lot of voters in the United States. I think collectively for world security, that's not necessarily a good thing. But he's quite unpredictable. So who knows what will happen after the elections, and who knows what the elections are tight enough to sit here with bated breath and wait for the outcome.
Yeah, definitely. Only time will reveal us what's up for the future.
Exactly.
So, yeah. So I really thanks Professor Gerwath for having joined us today. It has been a very pleasant, beautiful and stimulating discussion for all of us. I see many comments of appreciation for what you said and for your book. So I really thank you again. And yes, as Sabrina suggests in the comments, since I was missing the word previously, we reached our deadline of 1 hour, our target of 1 hour. So I think we can go for the conclusion. And I thank again very much Professor Gerwath. And I hope we will see you again on this same show next time.
Sure. It's a seminar.
Yeah.
It's a seminar. It's a seminar.
These young people, they think everything is a show. It's a seminar. It's a video seminar, but it's a seminar. In my channel, I call it Michelino's seminar. All right, Robert.
Thank you very much for your interest.
Right. Thanks for
your
Bye.
Bye.
Have a good evening.
Bye.